Welcome to Lesson 2 of the Bait of Satan course. I hope those that are watching online can see this and it's not a conglomerated mess. But I want everyone here to be able to see it and keep up. All I'm really using this for is to balance all the words I'm saying. That way you're not just listening. I'm giving you something to see because this is different than me preaching. I want to teach a point. I want to make a point that really drives home. Last week, I started it off asking, do you remember a moment that changed your life? An aha moment that when you finally understood a point that it changed everything. Today, I want you to ask, how could this happen to me? Because that's where we're going to stay at today. Can you remember a time in your life when you said to yourself, how could this happen to me? I've been there before, whether it was my own doing or not, it doesn't matter, but I remember looking around at the mess I was in and said, how could this have happened? Can I get a show of hands if anyone else has been there? Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. So we're dealing, for those that were not here last week, the bait of Satan, the bait is the offense. Those that become offended and don't know how to handle it, they take the bait and now they are trapped to do the devil's will by holding on to it, and offense will separate us from God. We're going to talk about a certain type of offense. If you were to take all the categories of folks who are offended, there's two categories. Just two. The first one are those who have genuinely been mistreated, and the others are those who think they have genuinely been mistreated. There is a difference. We're not going to talk about Lesson 2, or Category 2. We're not going to deal with the folks who have made up the offense in their mind. Whether they just for their own reasons have portrayed themselves as a victim, or maybe those who have accurate information, but they just discerned it inaccurately. And we're not worried about those. I'm worried about those who have been genuinely mistreated. That's where we're going to go today. Let me catch up. For those that are used to watching me do a certain thing, I've changed the mediums in which I'm teaching from, so it's just a little bit different. I hope to flow smoothly. For example, I just went way beyond where we was going to go. Now, going back to the beginning of the Bible, probably not the first person to be offended, but the first person to be offended at a great deal is Joseph in the coat of many colors. Y'all know the story of Joseph in the coat of many colors? Who gave him the coat of many colors? Young folks, here in the front row, why did his daddy give him the coat of many colors? Elijah?
He was the favorite.
He was the favorite. So we're going to spend a good deal talking about Joseph. We need to understand that Joseph is the 11th person of 12 brothers. Okay, the 11th son of Jacob and the great-grandson of Abraham. The first thing the Bible tells us about him when he shows up on the scene is that he's a bit of a tattletale. And then we find out that he's a bit of a braggart as well. The first thing we learn about him is the dude's got issues. He snitches on his brothers, and then he goes and brags to his brothers about his dreams, right? To make matters worse, he's daddy's favorite. Dads don't do that. My kids think I have favorites until I do something for the other one, then I have to remind them, you're not my favorite. I constantly have to tell Daniel, I love your sister and your brother just as much. And it's not because he thinks I am showing him favoritism. He doesn't understand why I sometimes put him aside and do something for them. Because I love them. He refuses to accept that. He thinks he's the favorite. But, so here we are. One night, he goes to sleep. And he has this dream of his brothers bowing down and serving him. And then he has another dream. Pretty much the same thing. It's the stars aligning and making him the center. Now, when this young man gets up with these dreams, he goes and he tells his brothers. Which one of y'all is the oldest? Chelsea. What if Beckett, if he could speak legibly and clearly, went up to you and said, Chelsea, I'm going to be your boss one day. Exactly. Now imagine being in ancient Egypt times, a time of true hierarchy, and the youngest at that time, Benjamin wasn't born yet, the youngest says, I'm going to be your boss, and they already hate you. And then you tell them that. So now the brothers are out for blood. They hate him and they're looking for an excuse. They're looking for a reason. While he may have been lack of wisdom, while he may have been foolish, did Joseph do anything wrong at this point? Did he commit a sin at this point? He just used a lack of judgment, but he's been fine. One day, Jacob sends him out to go check on the older sons, to watch the flocks. Just check on them. But they had went a great distance away, and it takes Joseph a minute to get there. So as he's coming, they see him coming, and they've got time to absorb the fact that the punk is coming. They have time to let the blood boil and to think about it and remember the dreams and remember the coat. That's how they can see him from a distance, probably. There's all those colors reminding them that he's the favorite. And so they say to themselves, let's kill him and see what becomes of his dream. How can he rule over us if he's dead? But what happens then, so they grab him, they take his coat from him, and then they throw him in the pit. Ooh, missed my slide. They throw him in that pit. And their plan is to rip the coat, coat it in animal's blood, and tell dear old Jacob, your baby boy got eaten. I'm sure he tasted well. And that was the original plan. But then, from a distance, they see a caravan of Ishmaelites coming, and they're going to do some slave trading in Egypt. Judah, the fourthborn, has this brilliant idea. Guys, if we kill him, we get rid of him, and that's it. But if we sell him, we get rid of him, and we make money. That sounds like a great plan. Reuben didn't want to kill him anyway, so Reuben thought that was a better plan. At least he lives, and he's out of their lives. Wonderful. Does anybody know how much they sold him for? 20. Nice try. Nice guess. I set you up for that. I tried to trick you. 20 pieces of silver. And then poof, he's off to Egypt. And I imagine he was begging his brothers for a little bit of mercy. Because we have to understand how big of a blow this really was for Joseph. It's hard for Americans in our country to really appreciate what just happened at this time. Right now, the poorest of us in this room still has a really good life compared to a lot of people in the world. They say if you've got just a matter of change in your pocket, you're among, what, the 70th percentile of wealthiest in the world? Because most people in the world don't have that. So go back to this time. Not only did he lose his freedom, girls. Not only did he lose his freedom and his daddy, but he lost his rich daddy. His daddy was very wealthy. His daddy was very blessed of God, and only good things were going to come because of that, and he was taken away from that. It'd been one thing if he was born a slave, because that's all the slave knows. But to be robbed from your privilege, to be robbed of your luxuries, and then put in a situation, makes it much more harder to deal with. Can we understand that? And then to be sold as a slave by your brothers, the ones who are supposed to have your back no matter what. In those days, as a foreigner, it was even worse because it was a permanent decision. You weren't indentured. There was no chance of working yourself out of slavery. You were bought, you were property forever. You can marry, and guess what your wife becomes? A slave. You can have kids, and guess what your kid is? A slave. Your entire destiny is now servitude and slavery. So basically, they did the worst thing they could do to Joseph besides kill him. They could not have done a more worse thing to him. While in Egypt, he sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. Joseph serves him for 10 years. That's a long time to grow up as someone's servant. But it wasn't all bad, because God blessed him, and he does a good job, and Potiphar promotes him. But can you imagine throughout this 10 years, he knows his dad is a wealthy, powerful man. So I wonder how many times in 10 years he kept looking over the hill expecting Dad to come around the corner. At any moment, his dad's going to come and save him. I wonder how many years it took him to realize that his dad thinks he's dead and no one's coming for him. That's sad. I wonder if he's thinking, them brothers are making off with all that money and they're spending all my inheritance. It's a tough 10 years. But like I said, he gets well-to-do. He's still a slave and is treated as a slave, but he gets put over all the affairs in Potiphar's house. So he has a little bit of freedom. He can walk around. But this introduces a new problem. Because Potiphar has a wife who's not very faithful. Potiphar's wife gets to like him and tries to seduce him. Every day she's begging him and begging him. Says, my husband's not home, nobody will know, we can do what we want to do. Here is a young man that shows incredible integrity. He keeps telling her, I refuse to sin against my God. I refuse to sin against your husband. And one day she gets a hold of that robe a little too tight and won't let go. And his only chance of getting away from her is to take it off and flee. There's an old expression, hell hath no scorn like a woman's scorn. Or a woman's anger. Whatever. I just know women angry is a bad thing. So now she's feeling jilted and rejected. And now she has evidence in her hands. So when Potiphar comes home, she says, look, your favorite slave tried to rape me. Potiphar doesn't even think about it. He doesn't doubt it for 1 second because that's his wife. I don't blame Potiphar for that. You're supposed to have your wife back, especially if she's got you fooled, thinking that she's a good person. So Potiphar throws him immediately in the dungeon. We need to understand what the difference between today's prison and Pharaoh's dungeon is. It's a big difference. I've had the privilege of visiting several jails in multiple prisons. I can tell you that Varner is no walk in the park. I can tell you that Varner is a horrible place to have to spend the night. But it is a country club compared to what these people went through in the dungeon. It was normally just a hollowed out cave, no light, just a hole that they can rot in, and they're given just enough food to live. Not enough bread to make yourself full. Not enough to say, oh, thank God I ate. Just enough to keep you alive because dying would be too easy. They want you to suffer. And when I say food, notice I said bread. There was no menu. You get just enough of this stale bread every day, just enough to last. So here we are in this damp, dark, cold prison. And the Bible says that these fetters here that they put on them, Psalms 105 and 18 says they laid his feet in irons and they hurt him in fetters. So now he's living in this prison wearing those chains and he's done nothing wrong. This is his reward for honoring God. Allow yourself to think like you know the thought had to be there. The Bible doesn't say he had any bad thoughts, but we know as humans, there had to have been a devil on the shoulder saying, look at your reward for being faithful. You are more faithful to Potiphar than his wife is, and look which one's in prison. What about his conversation with God? He says, I haven't done anything wrong. The only thing I did was share a dream that you gave me. And it got me in a pit. And the pit got me to Potiphar. And then I stood by your word and refused to sin against you. Look where I'm at. Seems like the more I obey you, the worse my life gets. Have you ever thought that? Let's be honest. Young folks, if you haven't now, the thoughts will cross your mind later. Because life happens to the best of us. I know many of folks who live for God their hardest, and they get slapped the hardest, and then they have to be real to themselves and admit, all right, God, I don't understand. This is not fair. It's okay to have those thoughts. It's what you do with them that matters. If you feed that thought, if you hang on to that thought, if you crave that thought, if you let it grow, shame on you. But if you can resist it and understand that God is still God, He'll give you strength for the next day. So he's got all this time. And he's probably thinking, what next? How can it get any worse? I want to stop before I go any further and talk about that mindset. Because he probably had a chance to blame his brothers. If my brothers hadn't have done this, I wouldn't be here now. Which, logically, makes sense. But how many times do we fall into that same kind of thinking? If it wasn't for my parents, I'd be a better person right now. If it wasn't for my brothers or my sisters, I would have succeeded at this by now. If it wasn't for that person at work who gossiped about me, I'd have that promotion by now. Are we relating to this a little bit? Is it sinking home every time you want to blame someone else? Even if on the surface it looks like it's their fault? Well, here's the truth. No person, nobody, no demon can remove you from the will of God except you. Nobody has the power to remove you from the will of God. The Bible says that God was speaking, it says, no man can pluck him from my hand. But how many times do we rebuke that hand and walk away on our own because we got our feelings hurt and we got offended? God holds your destiny. And if we get a hold of that truth, we become free people. His brothers didn't understand it. They're the ones I quoted earlier. I read to you Genesis 37 and 20. Let us come now, therefore, and let us slay him and cast him into some pit, and we will say, some evil beast has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams. The world wants to pull you out of the will of God. They intended to destroy any chance of him becoming a leader. Joseph could have sat there and stewed in bitter thoughts and plotted revenge against his brother. He could have thought the revenge. He knew his dream. You know what? If that dream ever comes true, guess what's going to happen to my brothers? But as far as we know, he didn't let that sink in. I believe if he had chosen that path like so many people do today, that he would have died in that prison. How many Christians today die in their own prison of resentment because they want to get revenge instead of trusting God to handle everything? Do you know what would have happened if he had gotten his revenge? He was the 11th of 12. He would have killed 10 out of the 12 tribes of Israel, including the tribe of Judah, where King David came out of, where Jesus came out of. How many destinies have we tried to ruin by taking revenge over our hurt feelings? You don't have the right to take revenge over your hurt feelings. You don't have, I told you last week, you don't have the right to stay offended. It is a trick of the devil to take that bait. See what the devil can do if we would just let him off of that bait and say, you're right. This is my bait. You're right. They did me wrong. This is my hurt feelings, and I'm going to nurture it. Serious business. I hope you're starting to see why I believe in this course so much. Because it's destroying destinies that we don't even see. And I want to ask you something. I forgot a slide there. Those are the 12 tribes of Israel. Benjamin was born eventually while but look at all those others he would have taken out. So I want to ask you something. When this happened, when he was thrown into prison, do you really think that God looked down on earth and said, oh, what am I going to do now? Do you think God had an ounce of panic? Oh man, I had plans for that guy. Oh shucks, I was going to make him a leader. Them earthlings done went and ruined my plan. That sounds silly, right? Then why do we act like God panics when it happens to us? God does not panic when you lose your job. He doesn't sit there and say, oh, what am I going to do now? That was it. That was my plan. If God doesn't panic, why do we? Because we're not God, or we don't have the faith in God. We have to make up our mind whether we really believe that our steps are ordered by God. We make up that mind. Don't let fear dictate it for you. God is not blindsided just because it didn't happen the way you thought it would happen. So now, he's back in the dungeon. I guess he's adapting to his new life. We don't know how long he was in the dungeon this time. It could have been a month, could have been weeks. We don't know. But he is tested again. Who remembers the test this time? Elijah.
I think a butcher. Wait, no, not a butcher.
A baker.
Yeah, baker.
And another B word.
Wait, another?
Butler.
Oh.
You're close. Hey. It is between you or Sister Hall. So good job. The more recent Sunday school teachers were looking at each other like, Rrr. That's right. He got a visit because the baker and the butler were also thrown into prison. Pharaoh had a temper. Got upset, threw them both in there. And then both of these clowns had a dream. They both had their own perspective dream. Imagine Joseph. Here's the test for Joseph, was his attitude towards it. Because one man had a dream. Come on now, keep up with me. There you go. Of the birds, and the other had the flowers or the grapes. And they had two different things. And Joseph told the baker, quite honestly, you're going to lose your head. Hate to tell you. But butler, good job for you. You're going to be reinstated to your office. But think about the meanness, if you will, of life to put Joseph in that position. What started all of this? A dream. And he shared the dream with people he trusted. And now come these people with their dreams. Tell me you can understand the frustration. I bet you can picture modern Christians telling them, you had a dream? I had a dream once. Don't talk to me about your dream. We shut people out all the time. Those were those strongholds we talked about last week, those walls we put up. I don't want to talk about it no more. But he didn't do that. Amazingly, he looked at them. And he had this choice that he could be bitter or better. And he chose to be better. And he said, God is faithful. Let me tell you what your dreams mean. Can you in your darkest of prisons say God is faithful? The only reason why you can't is because you're holding on to that offense. You're taking that bait. Well, that'll preach. What robs God of his praise? We're too busy chewing on hurt feelings. Mercy, Lord. Forgive us. But he said God is faithful. And he tells them what's going to happen. And it does. It happens just as it was proclaimed. It happened exactly, sure enough. The baker was killed and the butler was reinstated. But before the butler goes back to the palace, Joseph asked him for one thing. One thing. He said, when you're back in the palace, would you please remember me? Tell the Pharaoh about it. And of course, just like we can imagine, the butler forgot him. And he's back in prison for another, or I should say back, he's still in prison for another 2 years. Can it really get any worse than that? Your one hope of salvation, which came at a personal dig, you had to swallow your pride and get slapped in the face with the irony that someone else is getting to see their dream come true, and here you are for the sake of your dream, and all you asked was for a little kindness. 2 years. We need to remember that he didn't have the book of Genesis to read. He didn't get to see the end chapter and know how this story ended. All he saw was the bars in front of him. Knowing that he was stabbed in the back by everyone in his life. And he's just sitting there, back in his fetters, back in his irons, with just enough bread to not starve to death. Here comes another kicker. 2 years later, I told you he's in prison for another 2 years later. What happens? Oh, thank God, one of the ministerial staff knew an answer. Pharaoh had a dream. Pharaoh had a couple of dreams, but they all amounted to the same thing. We got our, the temptation to be ugly. We have our 7 fat cows, and then we have our 7 scrawny cows. And the Bible says that the scrawny cows devoured the fat cows. Well, this freaked out the Pharaoh. He didn't know what to do with it, and none of his wise men could help him either. And then finally, the butler remembers, and he says, I have sinned, but I do know a man. And he tells him how he interpreted the dreams, and both the dreams came true. Pharaoh immediately brings him out of prison to interpret his dream. Here he is now, dust, dirt, weak, sore, asked to interpret another dream. All because he had a dream. But he tells him about the 7 years of plenty and then the 7 years of drought and famine. He said you better use these good years while you can to prepare for the bad years. And then just like that, Pharaoh's impressed and sets him up to be number 2 in the country. Who was number 1 in the country? Pharaoh. So that means, if you think about it, Joseph, just like that, all of a sudden outranked that person who brought him out of the prison. I wonder if that person kicked him along the way. Come on! And what if he had? And now they put in this robe and this ring on this slave that you just kicked. Be careful what you treat. You never know. So now Joseph is set up to be second in command of all Egypt, the most powerful nation in the world at that time. After 2 years of famine, which was 9 years after he was pulled out of slavery, 21 years since he had the dream of becoming a leader, his brothers show up. I'm going to spare you the games that he played. But in the long run, he blessed them. He could have been mean. He could have exacted his revenge because he recognized them. They did not recognize him. He could have done whatever he wanted to do. But in the end, he wound up giving them their money back, giving them all the food, hugging their necks, bringing them up out of Canaan, gave them the best land in Egypt. And he saved them. The Bible describes it like this. Here's what he had to tell his brothers. Now therefore, be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves, that ye sold me hither. For God did send me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years in which there shall neither be eating nor harvest. Earing nor harvest. Same thing. And God sent me before you to... I forgot to change these scriptures for you. Oh, I'm sorry. Looky there. For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years in the which there shall neither be earing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God. And he hath made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house, and ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. What an attitude. What a mindset. What a perspective. I wonder if the brothers thought he was nuts. I mean, he made it look good on the end, but I'm pretty sure Judah's like, I'm pretty sure I'm the one that came up with the idea of selling you. I'm pretty sure I was there. This was my idea. But the psalmist confirms it. Psalms 105, starting at 16. Moreover, he called for a famine upon the land, and he brake the whole staff of bread. He sent a man before them, even Joseph, who was sold for a servant, whose feet they hurt with fetters. He was laid in iron. Until the time that his word came, the word of the Lord tried him. The king sent and loosed him, even the ruler of the people, and let him go free. What an attitude. Remember what I told you earlier? Absolutely no man, no woman, nor demon can ever get you out of the will of God, except who? Only yourself. The brothers tried. Potiphar's wife tried. The butler tried. No one was able to stop Joseph from achieving what God had promised him a long time ago. See, God told the children of Israel, you're about to enter into the land that I promised your fathers. It's all yours. I'm giving it to you. But they got offended. The children of Israel got their feelings hurt because things were not happening the way they wanted them to happen. They were complaining about going here. They were complaining about eating this. And they were complaining about having to do that. And they got offended. They said they were offended with Moses. But God told Moses, they're not offended with you. They're offended with me. They just don't have the guts to say they're offended with me, so they're blaming you. That offense cost them their destiny. It cost them their promised land. What promised land are you selling out just to hold on to your hurt feelings? Those adults never got to step foot on that promised land. When they left their Egypt, they never made it because of their offenses that they held on to and what it did with their mind. Some of us have been promised things and we sold it out a long time ago because we got our feelings hurt. Maybe you've been promised a ministry, but it didn't happen as fast as you would like, so you gave up. Maybe you were promised this or promised that, and you just let it go. You're the one selling out your promised land, not those who hurt your feelings. And if you get this revelation, then your life will be changed forever. The only one who can get you out of the will of God is you. And that's when you take the bait of Satan. Did you know that God wrote a book about you before you were born? That doesn't get taught a lot in Sunday school. David said in Psalms 139, "You saw me before I was born. Every day of my life was recorded in your book." God has a book with us in it. Every moment of your life was laid out before a single day had passed. Psalms 37 says, "The Lord directs the steps of the godly. He delights in every detail of their lives." God knows we will live in an evil world where people make mistakes and sin, just as Joseph's brothers sinned against him. Now here's the thing. He does not cause those people to treat us evil. He doesn't cause it. But because he knows what they're going to do, he uses that to bring forth his plan. To me, that's a pretty neat slap in the face of the devil. That God can use his tricks to bless us. He doesn't do it in spite of the devil. He does it with the devil. I'm not saying he's in cahoots. He's just, God is the ultimate puppeteer. And the devil can't stop him from his plans. I imagine it never did cross Joseph's mind until everything was over, that all that he went through was God's process to prepare him to rule. There's a process here. Before he went through the years of waiting, how did we first describe him? That as a tattletale and a braggart. If he was in that mode and in that condition, put in a situation later, he would not have been mature enough and wise enough to handle it. Oh, I feel a little resentment now. Oh, I love that spirit. There are folks who understood what I just said, but you saw the dots connected to your own life. You don't want to go through that process for what's better for you. But that's exactly what God did and still does today. It's called a refining process. Joseph had to be refined. And it shows. Because the first thing he said to his brothers was that I love you. And it was not, I blame you. But that would not have been to Joseph before it all happened. Because Joseph before it all happened was a braggart. And when he said, look where I'm at. But he needed to be humbled. Some of us are getting it. Some of us are evaluating the things we're going through and wondering, all right, maybe I've been looking at this all wrong. That's great. That's spiritual growth. I need us all to do that. Reevaluate where you're at in your life. Reignite that faith that God is in control. Remind yourself, just like Joseph did, that God did this for the sake of their family. Now here's what Peter said about being refined. And this is from the English Standard Version. 1 Peter 1:6. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials. First of all, if necessary. Not everyone has to be refined. In case you're wondering why some people don't go through it, they didn't need to. But if need be, you will go through a trial for the sake of refinement. What's a little while to God? There's a mathematical answer. Because we know that one day is as 1,000 years with the Lord, right? So by using that math, if one day is 1,000 years, then 1 hour is about 43 years. So 15 minutes, what you and I would call a little while, is 7 or 8 years. Just 15 minutes. A little while. And that's if it's a short little while. If you're waiting at a VA doctor, you're talking hours. And if 15 minutes is 7 or 8 years, then we're talking at least 40 years of a little while. Though now for a little while, if need be. Joseph needed to be refined because he didn't have the character when he was a teenager. Going back to that verse, in this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials. So that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. The author of this series tells a wonderful story, and he's being transparent about trials that he went through. He said for 6 months there was times that he would just close the office doors and put his head in the corner and say, God, why do I hurt so bad inside? I'm living in pain. I wake up in pain. I come to the office in pain. I go home in pain. I am living in pain. He says, the Lord told him, because you're dying. There's always pain and death. God's talking about something spiritual here, not talking about predicting his future physical death. God told him, you want to know how to know when you're dead? When you stop hurting. Dead people don't hurt. He said, God, please kill me quick. And then a little while later, he's still mulling over this. He realized that he became angry at everyone and was constantly mad and yelling at everyone. He was mad at his friends. He was mad at his pastor. He was mad at his co-workers. He was mad at his wife. He said he was even mad at his little boy who was less than a year old at the time. And one day as he was heading out to the prayer grounds, he asked God, where is all this anger coming from? Because he recognized it's not him. He's always been a happy kind of guy. And I love the story that he tells. God said, look at the gold ring on your finger, referring to the wedding band. So he looked at the ring. And he said, does it look like pure gold to you? Yes, sir, it does. But is it? No, sir. It's 14 karat gold. In case you didn't know, let's break that down. So 14 karat means 14 parts out of the 24 parts are gold, but the remaining 10 are made up of lesser metals such as copper, zinc, and nickel. So he's got a 14 karat gold ring, which means almost half of it is something other than gold. 58.5% pure is 14 karat. God said, what happens if you put that ring in a furnace and heat it up to 7,000 degrees? What happens? The author says it liquefies. God said, and then what happens? He said he had to think about it for a second. He goes, well, the lesser metals, the impurities, they rise to the top. God says, you mean they appear? Yeah, they appeared. God said they were always in there, but not visible to you. I saw them all the time. God told me, he goes, you're asking where all this anger is coming from? It's always been in you. And I brought you to the furnace of my affliction, which is referenced in Isaiah 48:10. This affliction is causing the impurities in you to come to the surface. Now, when you blame your wife, your son, your pastor, your co-workers, whoever you know, what happens? All those impurities will go right back down, and we'll have to start the process all over again. Or you can say to me, God, it's all me, take it out. He said God told him that he will take his big ladle and scoop out the impurities so that his heart can become pure. And that then he could use him for greater levels of leadership. What a prayer. Are you ready for that prayer in your life? God, refine me. God, put me in that furnace. Make the impurities come out of me. See, it's necessary, but we don't want to say it. We would much rather God just remove them. But God wants us to come to him. That's why this course is so important. That's why those steps to freedom are so important. God is not just going to magically take out the offense from you. You've got to recognize that garbage is in you and go through the process of letting it go. Go back to Joseph. The abuse and betrayal of his brothers ended up being the pathway to his destiny. I need you to see this. Often the thing that looks like an abortion of God's plan is actually what ends up being the road to its fulfillment. If, and this is a huge if we stay in obedience and free from offense. The next time you think you're going through hell, remember Joseph. Remember what he went through. And do not take the bait of Satan. Do we have any questions before we move on to the discussion questions? Nope. Good job. So, it occurs to me that I did not download, and this, no, I hit the wrong, man, I'm on recording, messed up, but use the wrong thumb drive, I've got the wrong notes, don't have my questions. But they're up here, so I guess I can read them this way. I want feedback. Do you think Joseph had to work through any feelings of anger, hatred, bitterness, or revenge? But the Bible doesn't say that, so how do you know?
He was human.
He was human. So, when you feel those issues come up, are you sinning for having that thought? No. Not at all. The Bible says, be angry and sin not. That's important because we misunderstand our emotions. And this is not there. This is me just telling you from experience. We're so afraid of thinking wrong that we never allow ourselves to process the emotions. That's what I always tell somebody when they're grieving. Let yourself grieve. It's okay if you're hurt. It's okay if you're mad at God that so-and-so died. Tell them. It's when you pretend you're not upset that you can never handle the process and heal. So absolutely, I'm sure he had those feelings. In what ways can you personally identify with Joseph's story? How does his response and how was he rewarded give you hope and encouragement? Can anybody personally identify? I was told not to introduce too much of my personal life no more. So I can't answer all these discussion questions like I did last week. I'm not allowed to be as transparent as I would like. As a matter of fact, I was just told to shut up. I'm sure that there's been times where you were honestly, genuinely mistreated. Not a misunderstanding, but just flat out meanness. I hope this story gives you encouragement, letting you know that God's still in control. I may not have the answers to tell you now why or how God's going to do it, but I choose to have more faith than fear. I choose to have more faith than doubt, more faith than anger, and more faith than hurt. Everything makes sense when you do it that way. All right. Jesus also suffered greatly. We know that. The Bible says that even though we learned what he went through in Calvary, we learned what he went through, he was mistreated basically his whole life. People just didn't give him the benefit of the doubt. Am I still on the right question? No, I started reading the wrong question. There we go. What do the examples from Jesus' and Joseph's life speak to you about the purpose of your hardships? Someone encourage this pastor today. Tell me that something resonated with you.
You can learn from your hardships.
What can you learn from your hardships?
Depending on the hardship, I would assume you could learn to trust in the Lord. You can learn to patience. There you go.
Definitely can learn patience. What about a financial hardship? What if you lose your job? What can you learn from that? That God's a provider. That's maybe some things that you thought were important are not so important after all. I like to remind folks the story of Paul being shipwrecked. The Bible says that when the storms came, they started throwing things overboard. I'm here to tell you, you don't take on unnecessary stuff when you go out to sea. The cruise line maybe, but their kind of boat, they only took what they thought was important to begin with. And now they're tossing things they thought they had to have. It's funny what storms can show you in your life. You don't really need that after all. Number 4, somebody other than the front pew. And other than Elijah, because he answered the other ones. Look back over your life. Recall a situation in which you were hurt or mistreated in what seemed like the worst possible way. Can you see something positive about it now that you couldn't see then?
I do.
Please, share. If you're comfortable sharing on camera.
I'm sharing it. Years ago, I was accused of something that I didn't do. And the pastor took me off of men. At that time I played men. And I didn't do it. And it hurt me real bad. And I quit coming to church over it. And I told my husband about it. He said, well, what are you going to do about it? I said, I really don't know. And I really didn't know at that time. And I miss church. I missed it so bad. I didn't stay out very long. But when I came back, I would have crawled in this church. He humbled me. He humbled me. And nobody, no matter what anybody did to me or said to me then, I would have took it. I just wanted to be back in church.
Beautiful. Sister Hall, that's a wonderful example. Thank you for sharing that. And as a pastor, I'm glad you brought that up. I'm not accusing you of that. I'm just using your story to segue into what happens a lot in our churches because we become entitled to our positions.
Well, about 2 or 3 months later, the truth came out. Somebody got up and testified, and the truth came out, and he's mad. And that's what God did for me.
Wonderful. He gave you a better spirit and restored your reputation.
That's right. That's right.
Like I said, don't let entitlement. No one owns that piano. That is not Sister Yates' piano. These are not Daniel's drums. This is not my pulpit. No one is entitled to anything. And sometimes we base our identity on that thing. We think we can't go to church if we're not Sunday school teacher. I can't go to church if I'm not song leader. So we have to be humble and realize I'm just thankful to be in the house of God. If I get to serve, I get to serve. Thank you so much. And again, my example was not you. It just gave me something to share. I appreciate the thought. Both Joseph and Jesus endured severe suffering. How do you think they endured the bitterest kind? What do you think hurt Jesus the most? I have my theory. And I'll preach it occasionally from time to time. It's actually my second message I've ever preached. What do you think hurt Jesus the most? Betrayal? Could have been. I think there was one more painful than Judas betraying with a kiss. I think it had to do with that cock crowing 3 times. I think it has everything to do with Peter, who said, Lord, I will die before I deny you. And the reason why I say that, because the book of Luke says that when the cock crew, the Bible says, and Jesus turned and looked upon Peter, who wasn't exactly in eyesight. They were hiding off in the distance. But Jesus knew where he was, and he heard that chicken crow, and he knew what that meant. I think that hurt him the most. But what did he say when he hung up there? Forgive them. That didn't go just for the soldiers. That went for everyone involved. Joseph forgave his brothers. I think what we can gather from these stories is that we need to forgive. I tell you what, before I move on, I want to share a story. I realize I'm being recorded, and that's good. One of the stories that haunts me and changed the way I perceive fatherhood. There was a gentleman who went to church, one of our churches, not in section 2, but in a different section. And he didn't just attend, but he was involved. He was one of the pillars. Everyone loved him, respected him. He carried his weight around. Man, he was an absolute asset to the church. But he had a daughter who was dumber than a bag of bricks at that time. And she fell in love with a boy that was not good for her. Let that be, just because you love them is not a good reason to hang on to them. It's not God's fault that you fell in love with something you shouldn't have fell in love with. You wouldn't fall in love with them if you didn't hang out with them. So, but she fell in love with him, and it became a problem, and he kept telling her, I don't want you seeing this boy. And he told the boy, don't come around. And sure enough, though, what was happening was every time he went to work, the boy was coming over. And one day, somebody from church saw the boy's car in the driveway as they drove by. I remember speaking to one of the ministers, and it with tears in his eyes because I wish they would have called us, because it was a known issue among the ministry that this is a bad deal. I wish he would have called us, but he called the dad and said, "Oh, boy's at your house." And he went into the house, and the boy, not having a shred of a backbone, locked the bedroom door. And the dad is banging on it, and the daughter, not having a shred of dignity for her daughter to end it, is staying there in the bedroom. Dad says, okay. In his mind, men, you can understand. I'm not justifying it. We can understand. He has to resolve this. He goes and gets his gun. And he fires a warning shot at the bottom of the door. He did not know that young man was sitting at the foot of the door. He did not kill him. He shot him in the spine, permanently paralyzing that young man. Where do you think I met this Christian? Knowing my ministerial background, where do you think I met him? In the prison. He was wearing his white jumpsuit, had his sentence. His daughter needed her daddy more than his daddy needed his pride. What did David do while he was out trying to fight Israel, and while he was gone, another army came and took all the women and children and burned the city? He did not gather up his manly pride and say, bless God, I'm going to do what a man's supposed to do. He prayed about it first. God, do I pursue? And if God had said no, he would have counted his losses. But God said pursue, and he did. He got them all back. This man failed to pray first. He let his flesh speak out. He let his offense. He took that bait. His pride was hurt. His feelings was hurt. He acted, and then he went to prison. Spent 5-6 years in prison. Changed everything. Over a punk. A punk who didn't blame him. And actually testified his defense. Saying, I shouldn't have been there. Didn't matter. If the man had chosen to pray, let his Christianity speak out more than his flesh, he could have learned to forgive him before shooting. Let that, it changed. That's why when my kids ask me what would I do in a certain situation, I tell them, I don't know. I don't want to know. So we need to keep our eyes on Jesus, who both began and finished his race. And when he was on that cross, he died. The flesh died. We know Jesus is God. but the flesh died in perfect obedience to God. That's awesome. What an example to set for us for the rest of our lives. I pray that in our worst moments we're still found in total obedience to God. All right. We're going to go through some highlights real quick. We're wrapping up. Young folks, I can feel you getting restless. You've done well, considering that you weren't prepared for this. I appreciate you. Stop that. No sneezing. All right, well, we're going to go through the highlights together then, because I didn't save that here. All right. All of us will experience mistreatment in this life. When it happens, we have two options. We can give in to the temptation to blame others and complain to God, or we can let go of the offense and leave it in God's hands. It truly is that simple. May not be that easy, but it is that simple. If we choose to trust Him and not be offended, we'll come out of it better and not bitter. No human on earth and no devil out of hell can ever take you out of God's will. He holds your destiny securely in His hands. The only one who can take you out of His will is God is never shocked or surprised or shaken by what we go through. His plans for us are solidified, not shattered by the enemy's schemes. God has already laid out the master plan for our lives. Before earth's foundations, He chose us as a secret weapon for this time. He has a specific life mission for each of us to complete. But training always comes before a mission. I'm big on training. The military put that in me. Often, what looks like an abortion of God's plan, I said earlier, can actually be the road to its fulfillment if we stay obedient to Him and stay the course. Make sure you do your steps of freedom. There's 5 steps. Please have them done before next Wednesday. Take your time. Get it done. Remember, lastly, every course, every week, we'll have a take action. We didn't get to do it, or last week's take action was to write your letter. I hope we wrote our letter. I'm not going to address the awkward silence and the awkward spirit I felt right there. I don't even want to look at people. I'm going to look at the screen. What do you see right here? A young lady or an old lady?
Young.
Who sees the old lady? Who sees both? Who sees only one? That's the snoz of the old lady. The chin, the mouth.
I see a young lady. I don't see the old
The,
lady.
the,
Where's
the
lady?
jawline is her nose on the old lady.
Yep. So I said, this is the mouth. She's got her little mouth open. Her dentures are going right here.
I just see one.
Oh, I see both of them now. I see the face is the nose, and then
The point is, different perspectives. We see things differently. So that's the action. Mistreatment.
What does this mean?
Sometimes what you see is not what you're looking at. Just because you cannot see the old lady don't mean it's not there. I'm going to step out. I know she's there.
there are 2 eyes, and then there's the nose
Yes.
and the
Wait,
mouth.
where's the eyes?
I see one
Right
lady.
there,
Are there
right
two?
there.
Show her the nose.
Big old snoz.
Now show her the mouth. And the
Mouth.
chin.
I don't see it.
That's her fault.
I don't see the nose. That doesn't look like a nose.
It's the point of the lesson. It's the point of the lesson.
Looks like
Sometimes God's plan is right there. Some of us are smart enough to see it.
I see it now.
looks like a cartoon
It's like
character.
a-
I don't see nothing.
You don't see it.
Oh,
You're
that-
right,
Put your
you're
chin
cute.
back.
Here goes
Got
the
something
stuff.
over her head.
Oh, I gotta move on before I say mean things. Y'all are testing my
Keep
flesh.
going. Roll it along.
Not that I'm getting angry, just I'm feeling hungry. So, need to realize that sometimes what's on the surface is not all that's there. There's more to be seen. Mistreatment always brings us to a crossroad. Blame God, or blaming and complaining, or trusting God and leaving the offenses in His hands. You choose, bitter or better. That concludes this week's lesson of Bait of Satan. Elijah, you can go. I want to end it in prayer. Are you starting to see a little bit of how this is important to our lives?